coming to find out more about our review of the energy efficiency requirements in related areas of building regulations. We're recording this session, this awareness raising session, and they may be placed on our website for those wanting to review the presentation or who miss it. So hopefully everything's correct and that's okay. This is the fourth session in our series, taking place more or less weekly, reviewing all the aspects of a consultation discussion document that we put out on the 26th of July, and it runs until the 15th of November. Our presentations here and these instalments are aimed at people with some familiarity with building regulations to kind of cover some of the areas that are in the document. If you have any questions today, there's a Q&A function. If you have any difficulty accessing that, you can always use our email address. We'll have a quick glance at that too. But if you have a question and you want to sort of note the slide that it relates to or anything, or if you just have a question, you put it in the Q&A section, and if we have some time at the end of the session, we'll try and come back to you on that. Yeah, our consultation runs from the 26th of July to the 15th of November, as I said. The documents are available on our website, the link's there, and it's great if people can respond on citizen space. We have to encourage that. That's a much easier way for us to handle that when it comes in. So if that's possible, we'd be grateful for that. And if anyone has any queries, you can again contact us at our web address. There are quite a lot of questions, and the discussion documents really very wide ranging, but they do come in sections. So this section today is all about the proposals on ventilation. There's our main document. It's all about ventilation, and we're looking to cover both dwellings and non-dwellings, or buildings other than dwellings. In the consultation document, dwellings in relation to ventilation are kind of covered in section 3C, and the areas other than dwellings are covered in section 4C. And just to be aware that unlike some of the earlier sessions, which have even more proposals on energy efficiency, these are a bit more compact. So each of these sections includes the proposals for both new build construction and for work to existing buildings. So a bit more compact. And we've got a usual kind of emphasis here, which is just to remind people that the building regulations only apply when work is already proposed or is being carried out. So we're not talking about applying fitness standards or requiring ventilation to be done in existing buildings or existing buildings to be brought up to a ventilation standard or anything. It's very much the standards that will apply when work is already being done. So we're not requiring improved ventilation to the existing stock. As a matter of course, that would only occur whenever you're getting work done. So the discussions that we're looking at are principally based on measures introduced in revisions to approved document F in England and in Wales. They have their own guidance documents, but they have a similar approach. And those documents came into operation in 2022, or published in 21, but they come into operation from June 2022. We do touch on a couple of other items, which sort of look into some of the issues, or some of the approaches in Scotland, and we're not quite sure if we were to do those other items, when they might occur. Some of those might be best left for phase 4, but we'll come to those as it comes. But as I say, principally focused on trying to catch up to a position and learn from the implementation and development of proposals that have occurred in England and Wales. And that was developed under their kind of initial Future Homes consultation. So that consultation referenced research by what was then the Ministry for Housing, I think that should be MHCLG, Housing Communities and Local Government. And it has pointed to concerns around poor indoor air quality in dwellings, and highlighting various issues such as closed trickle vents and noisy fans and things, leading to unintended outcomes or into poor air quality results. It ties in with some of the issues about in leakier and traditionally less airtight construction. Would have a level of a reasonable level of uncontrolled background infiltration, which doesn't really occur in new, better sealed buildings. And in these more airtight dwellings in particular, the standards have been set so that if you have a very airtight dwelling, a proposal had been that you had to have additional compensatory vents to that which you would have in a building with quite high infiltration levels or relatively high infiltration levels. And those additional compensatory vents, though, have in turn potentially led to problems. They're set with a degree of a factor of safety to do with variable weather conditions and wind speeds, and because you've got lower background infiltration. But that in turn can lead to unwanted drafts and the blocking and the closure of vents, as occupants prioritise thermal comfort over indoor air quality. And the response to these kind of issues has tended to be support moves toward more controlled continuous mechanical ventilation or mechanical ventilation solutions, relying on low pressure fans extracting and or supplying air to rooms. That in turn requires some additional energy to operate those systems. So that strengthens the argument that if you are to go to there, you really should have really very good, very airtight construction to avoid wasteful or excessive use there. And the other obvious measure that comes with continuous systems is the possibility for combining them with supply and extract with heat exchangers, MVHR, mechanical ventilation and heat recovery to improve the energy performance. But then, in turn, with these mechanical installations, there can be problems too, such as poor planning of the ductwork routes, poor installation practices, failures to consider cleaning and access arrangements for filters and things like that. Behavioural issues can occur in that people think they might save energy by switching off all these fans that are running all day, or they may not have the resource or capacity or find it easy to change filters and things like that. Getting the right product and having the right product support that works with that and works for these mechanical systems might also be an issue for some people or in some occasions. So the developments in the 2021 and 2022 amendments made in the other regions are really trying to seek a balance on all of these issues. That's the way we kind of see it. There doesn't seem to be a firm or absolute change of practice yet, but it's trying to get the right kind of overall balance in the proposals, so that there's space for considerations that are needed. There were no legislative changes made in England and Wales when they implemented their changes, so it's all changes in guidance. And I think there's a general acceptance, certainly we would accept, that not all of these issues can or will have been fully addressed. There's a balance to be found, and we recognise that ongoing review is likely to be necessary, with further interventions maybe in subsequent phases and uplifts that might occur later on. So very much a kind of picture where we're seeking improvement and where we're not able to necessarily always get perfection, and we don't want perfection to get in the way of where improvement could be made. So as with many of the other documents, just a general sort of thing about the layout of the documents. So England and Wales have kind of published two separate booklets now for Part F, one for dwellings, one for buildings other than dwellings. They've also brought some of the guidance that would have appeared in a second tier, a document called the Domestic Ventilation Compliance Guide. Some of the extracts from that have been merged into each of these where appropriate. So that third tier or second tier document, the Domestic Ventilation Compliance Guide, wouldn't be necessary for building regulations consideration any longer. And we're suggesting, one of our initial questions here is to suggest that we replicate that approach here. So that's just a comment about the overall layout of the documents. There's just straight up, it's worth highlighting that passive stack ventilation solutions have been removed from the guidance. That's because they were used in less than 1% of installations. And this removal simplifies the overall document quite substantially. It means that there's only really 3 systems that are fundamentally considered. That is natural ventilation, continuous mechanical ventilation, which has, and then the third one is continuous mechanical supply and extract. So you've continuous mechanical ventilation, the second one with background ventilation coming in, and then you've continuous mechanical supply and extract ventilation, and that would be the type, obviously, that can be supplemented with heat recovery. And those are the 3 systems that are discussed. England's consultation noted that it is the government's view that for scenarios outside the scope of these systems, suitable expert advice should be sought in order to ensure new homes provide healthy indoor environments whilst delivering lower carbon emissions. And this phrase, expert advice, is an interesting one. Councils and enforcement bodies might be particularly interested in the comment on that, because it places quite a lot of the directions in the approved documents, and in the new approach sort of says, if you can't do this, go and get the expert advice, and if the expert advice is received, then you can work with that. So it references expert advice in my reading of it reasonably frequently as a potential outcome, and it defines expert advice as advice from a suitably qualified, competent person. It then gives examples of what that might be, but it includes engineers, building service specialists, or a specialist ventilation manufacturer or a member of professional trade bodies. So quite wide scope there, I suggest, for what expert advice might constitute, and how more bespoke or considered solutions perhaps might be offered as alternatives to the sort of quite formal guidance provided on the 3 systems above in the bullet points above. In any case, dwellings are always expected to achieve in accordance with the current position, but they have to work for providing extractive ventilation that's usually for the removal of occasional high or localized levels of moisture or cooking contaminants. So those are often used, provided with extract vents or extract fans, sorry. Whole dwelling and background ventilation, so that's usually there to maintain the general air quality and remove moisture that hasn't been removed by the extract ventilation. So those are more kind of background habitable room type ventilation. And then purge ventilation, and that's really intended to move very high concentration of pollutants and water vapor, e.g. fumes from painting, but it's also used to provide extract ventilation from sanitary accommodation. Purge ventilation may not always be sufficient. This is for overheating purposes. So there are new parallel requirements came into place in England, and we'll be looking at that next week in our subsequent session on overheating. And it's likely that people would seek to have really very large purging airflow through dwellings, and we're not talking about that today. That additional ventilation for that purpose might be required under that part and under that requirement to that which we are discussing today. That's quite a separate kind of area. Although some of our proposals would maybe look at the purge rates that are being proposed here. So that can kind of interact with that. Probably one of the biggest single factors or biggest single issues then, as if we follow on from the concerns and research concerns that were raised, particularly around more airtight dwellings where there's less infiltration. Some of the most significant amendments are that natural ventilation is limited where it can be used, or that there are various thresholds applied to the 3 systems that we've discussed. So that in England and Wales, our reading of it is that natural ventilation can only apply to less airtight dwellings, and we think that these are those which are designed to have an air permeability greater than or equal to 5 cubic meters per hour per square meter at 50 pascals. So you have to be designing on the assumption that you're going to have an air permeability of 5 or greater, and your as-built test has to emerge with a result of 3 or greater. That's our reading. There's a bit of a question mark about that in the guidance where in England, but that's our reading of it as it stands. And the idea in the two different levels, I suppose, is that the difference of 2 provides a high factor of safety for the person who is designing the building and building the building, that even if they beat their expected level of performance, when they've got a bit of a factor of safety before they'd actually have to institute an alternative design or alternative measures. However, if they were to have a result of less than 3 on construction, or if they were designing for a result of less than 5, they're expected to have take steps to accommodate a different kind of system. So that could well be a kind of decentralized or centralized mechanical extract, continuous mechanical extract or a system where that's sought, or they may choose to get some of this expert advice that we've spoken about previously. So quite an interesting sort of set of thresholds there from England. Scotland have different thresholds and apply it much more, you could argue, consistently, in that they don't have a difference between their design and as built, but they have a rate of greater than or equal to 5 is the limit for natural ventilation, greater than or equal to 3 is the limit for mechanical extract ventilation. And whereas continuous supply and extract through a managed system is obviously suitable for any air tightness performance level. So at the very airtight construction, super airtight construction, perhaps down at Passive House standard or some standards like that, Scotland really do push you towards mechanical supply and extract. So the obvious suggestion might be that you might move to an MVHR system there to benefit or to maximise the benefit from that. The guidance in Ireland is also slightly different, but it anticipates an air tightness of no greater than 5. So that effectively seems to be, from our reading of it, might be the maximum permissible there. So that's what they're expecting. So they have 5 as a kind of absolute threshold you would expect, with natural ventilation able to be used where you're greater than or equal to 3. So they have more scope for the inclusion or use of natural ventilation. And then if you improve on that air tightness result such that you're lower than 3, you need appropriate additional measures, but we're not altogether clear how that would be established or what that might be, but that would need, you know, some careful consideration. And in all these cases where you've broached a threshold or breached a threshold, the redesign to an alternative system effectively is what's being talked about. So some kind of expert report to validate what you're doing, some adjustment, some move toward a continuous mechanical system, or a reset of the extract fans that you have to be able to do that. But you know, we appreciate that could be quite a risk, I suppose, for developers and for people who are building. So that's something in dwellings that we think is very kind of important. There's a debate to be had around what the appropriate thresholds and levels are, and that somewhat interacts with some of the previous sections that we've just had where we're discussing on the maximum permissible air tightness levels that might be permitted, particularly in new builds. So obviously if you were to set that at 6 or at 5, that would be, you know, well, if you were to set it at 5, that would look likely to push toward not having natural ventilation solutions whatsoever if you were to follow the English and Scottish and Welsh thresholds. So levels of 6, 7, or 8 might be the kind of levels of air tightness performance that might be more appropriate. Yeah, so that's what we've discussed here. I effectively a repetition of the English and Welsh ADs on this issue, the approved documents for those areas. That's their guidance documents. So we'd be looking at the same sort of set of provisions, and as we've said, that might interact with the limitations for new builds, where in other areas that was reduced from 8 to 10, but we had asked if an improvement on that below 8 might be appropriate in another question. But we'd still be interested to know if you think that this is the appropriate guidance to be implementing here for natural ventilation systems, so that they couldn't exist on their own if the building had an actual performance of below 3 or was designed to have a performance below 5. One final comment, which is just to be aware on air tightness. There is also a new aspect to the way that that would be assessed, where the numbers are rounded. So if you set a level of 5, that could be anywhere from 4.75 to 4.25, because they are rounded to the nearest half. You wouldn't get a level of 4.2 or 4.3. You would get a level of 4 or 4.5. That's the way the new proposals are on air tightness. So that also kind of comes into the assessment. In terms of background vents, we thought this was relatively interesting or important. So obviously the guidance is, since natural ventilation is no longer suitable for the lesser or for the highly airtight dwellings, the additional vents that currently are expected to be provided when you have more highly airtight dwellings are no longer kind of there to be factored in. Those levels of vents that created the drafts and that aren't really there. But there was also concern that maybe the levels that had previously been provided hadn't been sufficient in any case. So quite a fundamental review of some of the additional vent sizes for background trickle vents that were needed. There was also a change in the way that they're done. So those are now calculated on the basis of rooms rather than whole dwellings. And that's to ensure that each individual space is suitably provided for. And the specific vent sizes are in the approved document F1, and they were recalibrated from the original consultation proposals to facilitate current products and systems. So effectively, the consultation proposals that went out had to be adjusted on the basis of the feedback that came back from the consultation, and that was to help ensure that existing products and systems could continue to be used. And the vent sizes that were proposed vary depending on the system that's adopted. So if you look in the approved document, then table 1.7 outlines that some of the background ventilation sizes, which are increasingly kind of significant aspects in window design on glazing bars and with and through frame constructions and things. They applied those sizes, 10,000 10,000 square millimeters on some of the single-story dwellings, the ones that are lower down, presumably slightly lower wind speeds, and 8,000 in dwellings with multiple floors, and 4,000 cubic or square millimeters, to bathrooms. There's also whilst if you have a continuous ventilation system, continuous extract, then you'd be expected to provide 4,000 square millimeters rather than the 8 or 10,000 square millimeters for each habitable room. Scotland, interestingly, we noted had different and generally higher rates for these background vents, 10,000 being the more minimum requirement and 12,000 for each habitable room. I'm not sure if those levels are quite at that where there's continuous extract, but that's certainly the case in the natural ventilation scenario. Scotland has a term called an apartment which is really a habitable room. Whereas the Republic of Ireland seemed to have slightly lower levels from looking at it. All regions noted that natural ventilation provisions may not be appropriate for single aspect dwellings. So the cross ventilation of the dwelling for those vents to work were significant. You need to have a figure in my mind. It would need to be checked, but of 70%. So if 70% of your vents are all on one facade, that wouldn't be sufficient. You need to have no more than, I think you're meant to have a third of those background vents on opposing facades. And if you don't have that, you're into one of these cases where expert advice is required. Scotland additionally notes that vent sizes should be doubled where they're reliant on ductwork, and that's to allow for flow resistance. We think that's an interesting line to consider. So we'll be reviewing all of these things as we develop our guidance further with NIBRAC and others. But at this stage, we seem minded to progress in line with the kind of England and Wales approach in all of this, and we'll be interested in any feedback people might have to offer on that at this stage to help inform us and make sure we're not going down a wrong direction or failing to consider something which society or specialists think is important. Noise is an ongoing issue, and we're kind of alert on this. Considerations of external noise are normally addressed at planning stages, so acoustic baffles and vents are encouraged in our background vents and things to reduce external noise while considering the indoor air quality. There's not particularly any change in the measures coming through from England and Wales on that in terms of the general principle. There's also no explicit requirement for in situ acoustic testing of mechanical ventilation systems. That isn't yet introduced, but we are aware that could be a significant issue. One of those behavioural aspect changes that we mentioned earlier could be, that the noise frustrates people, so they turn the system off, and then they end up with a poor indoor air quality. But the guidance does set out some acoustic performance expectations. So whilst there's no testing, if there were to be a problem, the level of performance that might be expected is there and is noted. So that's the and that whole idea as to whether or not that might be included in some of the acoustic testing is being considered in England's review that might occur on its acoustic provisions in its Part E. That would be our Part G. So I think there's a bit of a push that should be considered under, if it were to be considered, it would be considered under the acoustic requirements and passage of sound requirements, and that might be a more appropriate place to regulate for this, because that's what's already set the standards for the people doing the tests and what those tests are, and outlines that in better detail in that part. But that's a consideration, and there is some strengthening there in the new decibel level levels indicated. There are also performance-based routes to compliance. So these something of this already exists in our Appendix A of our technical booklet K, and it sits in Appendix B of the approved documents F1 in England and Wales. So instead of setting up your ventilation rates and things like this, if you can show that the levels of contamination or pollution in the indoor air are no higher than the exposure limits and things in the tables in this way, then you may be in a position to validate that your ventilation proposal or your indoor air quality is adequate. And it sets levels to indicate the limits of moisture levels, indoor air pollutants, and bioeffluents. So these are the air pollutants that are there, and then there's another table there in terms of humidity for moisture. And if you can show those, that's kind of like an alternative route to compliance. We think that this is really very rarely used in practice, but it does provide a kind of important datum of expectations where an alternative design is proposed. And then there've been some changes to the overall tables. I've listed them out in 4 bullet points there, but they're relatively modest as I understand it. One is the inclusion of formaldehyde, or addition of maximum formaldehyde concentration levels. There's a suggestion that rather than using a total volatile organic compound levels, they would use an assessment of selected volatile organic compounds. So that's a new method that's been advocated by Public Health England's assessment. There's a change, a slight relaxation possibly, but then it's a different BS in going from 3.5 to 4 changes per hour when the assessment on bioeffluence and body odour is considered, and simplification of assumptions on infiltration rate. So there's a simplified assumption that you've 0.15 air changes per hour for less airtight dwellings or buildings. So that makes it a more straightforward approach as we understand it. So whilst we see this as incredibly rare, it does provide a useful, as we've said, datum of expectation. And so that's why it might be replicated, or we would expect to replicate the same position as they have in England and Wales in any proposals under our next uplift. The current technical booklet guidance on existing buildings then, or existing dwellings, when you're looking at existing dwellings rather than largely new build situations, which is what we've been talking about before, it tends to point to considerations of extensions where you're adding a habitable room, or where you're adding a wet room or a conservatory. So if you were to turn a room into a wet room, that would be the addition of a wet room, the addition of a conservatory, which could close or block off or create an internal room. And then you've got refurbishing kitchens and bathrooms, so kind of moisture centered consideration. There's some minor alterations on the existing to support the 4 cases above. The general principle is that newly created spaces or adapted spaces should be provided for in a similar way to new build dwellings, whilst other work to existing buildings should not reduce the previous ventilation performance. So if you're not changing the use of a bedroom, but you're replacing windows or doing something, some kind of alteration work, it shouldn't adversely impact the existing ventilation performance. And it may also need to take into account any improvements to the infiltration. If you've reduced the infiltration, the background infiltration, by making the system more airtight, the classic case would be a window replacement scenario. And the new guidance in England and Wales expands on this aspect. So there's a new aspect here, which is really to address common energy efficiency improvements, which are likely to have variable effects or vary the infiltration levels, particularly as they accumulate over time. So these are outlined. There are 2 methods to this, sorry. One is back to our friend, method 2, I'll just cover first, back to our friend expert advice. Assuming we're not looking at that. The other method, method 1, categorizes each of these energy efficiency improvement that you might do. That could be chimney sealing, or it could be removing a chimney and replacing it with a solid wall, or it could be putting on replacing windows or adding loft insulation or whatever it may be. And they get categorized as either a minor or a major intervention. And depending on how many minor and major and what combination you have, that leads to them being assigned a different category. So you can see it here in the table. This is the example of the work. If you're doing roof insulation and it's a loft conversion that includes changing a cold loft to a warm loft, i.e. putting insulation at roof level, that's actually considered a relatively minor category in terms of the ventilation for the rest of the dwelling. And the airtightness of the rest of the dwelling. However, other measures such as installing your internal wall insulation to more than 50% of the external wall area would be considered a major installation, a major category, sorry. And so if you've 4 major measures, you would be in category C, or if you had a combination of 3 minor measures and 2 major measures, you would be in category B. And they get added up, and they should be assessed then over time on the dwelling. They would build up cumulatively, so you'd need to look back at what has already been done to the dwelling. And basically, if you're in category A, the expectation is that whilst you may need to make sure you haven't made the situation any worse in that room, or that there's no sense that you've sort of reached a tipping point where you need a more fundamental review, the expectation would be, if the building were already naturally ventilated, that could continue. If you're in category B, you really need to do a more fulsome assessment and review it against the systems that are being offered in the technical booklet, or get some expert advice. And if you're in category C, then if you insist on using natural ventilation, you really would require expert advice on that. The common expectation would be you're likely to have pushed your building beyond the point where natural ventilation should be used. And so we've asked the question again on that as to whether that approach is an acceptable route for taking things forward here. We've already got reasonably extensive requirements in terms of validation of performance. So we require testing and commissioning of fixed mechanical ventilation. Regulation 67 requires notification of the airflow testing of installations in new dwellings, and that testing and commissioning information is passed to the District Council. Regulation 68 requires provision of the operation and maintenance information to the building owner, and notification that this has been done to the District Council. So information on the energy performance validation and a new home user guide has already been outlined in a different section when we talked about this in some of our Part F presentations. And basically, it's quite similar to Regulation 68, except that it's in a new kind of format. A home user guide, a more friendly home user guide is proposed, which is expected to provide non-technical advice on how to operate and maintain the dwelling in a healthy and efficient manner. So that aspect of things, as I say, is covered in the question following this on section 3A. And Appendix C of the updated approved document in England and Wales now notes that commissioning documents should be signed by a person who is both competent to install the system and responsible for installing and commissioning the system. So they're kind of expecting that the competence of the person signing off is considered. We've noted that the Republic of Ireland has a stronger level of oversight on this, in that they require that systems should be installed, balanced and commissioned by competent installers. That's largely in line with our own direction of travel, but it is an additional layer of oversight in requiring independent third-party validation checks by an independent competent person, and that effectively is someone who's certified or equivalent. I think that's by the National Standards Authority of Ireland. So that's quite an additional layer of oversight by a sort of approved body, with a assessment criteria in that which we don't really have access to yet here. And the department is keen to, so we're kind of keen to support improvements in this area, but that level of skills provision and accreditation, and that is quite a significant matter to be taken up, and it's probably a matter that's wider than just building regulations. But we're still interested in asking about the if you have any comment or insight on how we or others should support skills or site competence standards for the design, testing and commissioning of ventilation systems in dwellings. We're interested in whether there's industry has anything of import to say on that, or has a particular view on that, or whether the position in England and Wales is sufficient, or whether it's, even if it's insufficient, whether it's better than where we are now at least. And then question 3C.8, have you any other evidence or issues or suggestions on ventilation standards in dwellings which the department should consider? So that's quite an open question, and there's scope within that for people to give answers on any of these issues. We've got two potential additional items which are not in England and Wales proposals, and we've screened, I suppose, some of the provisions from Scotland with a view to this, and we're not clear at this stage whether there will be time or resource to bring this within phase 3 or phase 4, and we're not entirely sure on them. So they are open. we're putting them out there to see what the feedback might be. But we are noting that if you expect these to be included, it can potentially lead to delays and more complications in bringing forward the proposals, such as they are. But we thought there was a reasonably strong evidence, or they seem reasonably strong prima facie a case for considering them at least. So just coming back to some of the overall concerns on general indoor air quality, some of the research that MHCLG had cited, and that is again sort of covered by Scotland's Building Standards Division. And that was where 90% of occupiers believe their indoor air quality in their main bedrooms is good or fairly good. So most people feel okay and think it's all okay. However, when they monitor things on site, they find levels of carbon dioxide which aren't of a concern in terms of the carbon dioxide. They're at about 83% of properties were above 1,000 parts per million. That's not a particular problem in terms of carbon dioxide, but it would tend to suggest that there are likely to be other contaminants such as VOCs and formaldehyde, particulates, bacteria, etc., that could be a problem. So it's indicative of a problem in other areas, not the carbon dioxide itself, but indicative that there could be other pollutants likely to be something of an issue. And those other contaminants you see are much harder to identify accurately. They require more sensitive and more specific testing equipment. So nonetheless, the levels of CO2 are indicating this potential problem. So when they had that research, Scotland introduced a requirement for CO2 monitoring in the principal bedroom in new dwellings, and it introduced that in 2015. And the monitoring is intended to act as a proxy for the indoor air quality of the dwelling. And it doesn't provide an alarm, but it provides dwelling occupiers with an output result which, together with some of the guidance in the home user template, and that might suggest if you have a level of this, you should maybe open your bedroom windows more at night, or consider making sure all your background ventilators really are open. And it allows people to have a more interactive or a better feedback on just how their actual building's actually performing. We're not entirely sure how well or how successful implementation of CO2 monitoring is proven to be in practice. We're open to gain the evidence on it, and we know that there are findings and insights from further research or follow-up assessment in Scotland or elsewhere. So we think that this is possibly more an issue potentially as part of phase 4, because we wouldn't want to unduly delay the measures that we have proposed, but it's not clear to us that really will provide value for money, or that how successful the CO2 monitoring is actually proving in practice. Are people really using it? Are they looking at this feedback? Is it actually coming through? Or if the new guidance in itself would be that introduced in England and Wales might circumvent it or supersede it. So introducing it at the same time isn't something we're looking at straight away, but we are interested in this area, and whether CO2 monitoring in principal bedrooms and dwellings, or other spaces more extensively even in dwellings, might be something worth further exploration, possibly, if not immediately, certainly in the medium term. Another proposal, though, that we are considering and we'd be interested in is setting aside specific clothes drying facilities. So drying washing indoors obviously produces a large amount of water vapour and is frequently cited as a factor in addressing condensation, damp and mould in particular in dwellings. So building tighter, obviously, buildings could increase this risk. And Scotland's building standards, on kind of on foot of that, we've noted that they require dedicated indoor clothes drying space and an outdoor drying space where it is reasonably practicable. So under its guidance, the internal space needs to be a cubic metre with no dimension less than 700 millimetres, and both internal and external spaces should be provided with 1.7 metres of hanging line for each apartment, and that means each habitable room. So we think that you would have a space which would expand, or a lineal length of line which would expand depending on the size of the property. Any outside space should not be part of the dwelling's ownership. In Scotland, it's not one to allow communal drying spaces. They're not encouraged. And the internal space could be provided at high level over a bath or something if you're using a pulley system, but it shouldn't really inhibit your use of other facilities. And the idea, if I've got this, yeah, the space needs to be provided with a ventilation rate at 11 or 15 litres per second, connected to a humidistat to activate when the relative humidity is above a set value of between 50 and 65%. In many cases, this will utilise the existing extract in the bathroom or utility space. So you'd have a humidified fan operating whenever the humidity was high, and that would help ensure that the clothes drying wasn't leading to condensation or moisture in an unplanned space without adequate extract ventilation to attend to it. We think that clothes drying indoors like this is a likely outcome in most homes, or many homes, particularly with cost of living and expensive tumble dryer use and things. And the ventilation risk is, our ventilation guidance should specifically recognise this risk with an expectation of a humidity controlled extract ventilation in indoor areas where clothes drying is likely to occur. So our own instinct on this is relatively progressive, or we think that learning from that is there, but we're interested in the repercussions and need further investigation. There's obviously a demand then for space. So the expense and the impact of it and things could be quite a complicated thing to try and resolve. And that might mean that it can't necessarily be resolved in the next phase, but it's something we'd be keen to try and do. But we'd certainly welcome any evidence or insight or concerns that you might have in that on that item. So if we move now on to buildings other than dwellings, and we're concentrating again mainly on phase 3 here. By and large, there's a, broadly speaking, it's sort of largely similar approach to Section 3C on dwellings. It reflects the changes implemented in England and Wales as uplifts. We haven't really investigated Scotland to the same level of depth on the non-domestic side. In general terms, installations in non-domestic buildings, we're mindful that they're likely to incorporate a higher level of specialist M&E input with workplace health and safety considerations and maintenance in mind. Moisture risks in most non-domestic spaces tend to be lower, and where they are higher in because of manufacturing processes or swimming pools or commercial kitchens and things like that, there's a high level of specialist equipment and input into the design and the maintenance of those systems. Ventilation systems need to be carefully designed to ensure adequate indoor air quality. And one of the kind of themes, or one of the kind of interventions that came through from England and Wales, was a greater consideration of infection risks. And that's obviously in light of the COVID pandemic, and just addressing mechanical systems and the risks around that. So in keeping with dwellings, non-domestic buildings are still having to think about their extract ventilation, their background ventilation, and their purge ventilation. Provisions are largely considered in terms of the general building class. So there can be different intensities and different occupancy factors and things. So, so specialist situations such as particular manufacturing processes could, and even specialist situations like schools and hospitals, kind of require specific provisions outside the normal guidance requirements. In terms of noise, there was a bit of we've had a thoughts on this again, but it's really largely a very tricky issue. Mechanical vent, there's a clarity, or revisions have been made in England which emphasise that mechanical ventilation should be designed and installed to minimise noise. It sets some generic advice around selecting appropriate equipment, resilient mounting, duct sizing, but hasn't yet set specific numerical acoustic level performance requirements. And that would be a complicated area to explore and be influenced by the adjacent outdoor background noise and other considerations and things, which frankly are really quite specialist and probably beyond the resource that Northern Ireland could attend to deal with that. So again, they're looking at reviews under the passage of sound parts of the building regulation. So work may follow on that in due course. And then, yeah, there's some notes there again about the overall document coming together, taking the relevant extracts from ventilation compliance guides, and making sure that resilient mountings and minimising lengths of flexible ducts and general things that can influence noise, but also general installation and quality standards are kind of taken into the same document again. So there's also a similar level of performance in terms of, if you remember the chart that I showed on the levels of acceptable pollutants or relative humidity levels and things, they're all largely replicated again in the non-domestic side. And the document changes, again, splitting the two technical booklets, bringing in the relevant guidance from other sources into the document rather than citing them out. So again, we're looking to sort of replicate that approach. However, for all these specialist rooms and spaces, there's the start of them there. I think there's 2 pages of them on that diagram. Each of those requires really quite a specialist consideration. And there, that list, we've provided it in Annex F, or we've replicated it, so it's citing the relevant health technical memorandums or the relevant CIBSE guide for how to consider each specific space. And those really are, that there's quite a bank of information, and those are still referenced out. To include all of that advice within a document would just leave an enormously thick document. So they are still cited out, and they're listed there. And then the other thing to bear in mind is, obviously, in some residential building cases, there's a proposal or proposals on overheating assessment. So the new SAP software, which attends to dwellings, no longer provides an overheating risk assessment. So a new overheating assessment and specialist exercise will have to be undertaken for dwellings and for similar residential buildings. On the non-domestic energy assessment software, it will still provide something of that overheating risk assessment for most building types. But for the residential building cases, such as rooms in care homes or student accommodation and things like that, the domestic overheating assessment would still be needed, and the levels of ventilation in these specialist documents may not be sufficient for even their purge levels of ventilation may not be adequate. So that's something to consider. So if there are any concerns in that Appendix F and those list of guides, maybe there's an update since England's publication, or maybe there's some issues have actually emerged since it was published, and you're working on projects in England, or you're finding something is proving a bit of an issue. By all means, we're keen to hear the stories here, and we're keen to know if, where that might leave us. So that's but at the minute, the general expectation is we'd seek to replicate the updated standards as they are in England and Wales. So in terms of some of the more kind of infection risk issues, our document outlines 3 areas, but one is about having more air quality monitoring in certain spaces. Another one, the bottom one there, is about particular measures in offices, so some of the improvements to the circulation spaces and things. There's a correction to be made in our document. We had said that increased ventilation rates in certain spaces have been implemented in England. That wasn't that. There's a correction that we're going to have to make, and we'll be doing that in the coming days. That was a measure that was investigated by England, but actually wasn't taken forward. We do say that in a later paragraph, but there's a discrepancy in our document, so we'll be looking at that. But this was taken forward, and that is air quality monitoring using CO2 monitoring in offices, in spaces where loud speech or aerobic exercise or other aerosol generating activities are likely to take place, and where public spaces where the public are likely to meet. So there's quite a large number of areas there, and in occupiable rooms which are maintained at both low temperatures and low levels of humidity. So I think that was principally aimed at kind of, meat packing plants and cold rooms and spaces like that. There are limits to that, space size limits, and there are both minimum and maximum. And there are, a specific type of infrared CO2 monitor that would be required. And the intention there is that monitoring would provide people with, again, the kind of background information or feedback as to where they're at and whether their system is actually performing in practice. So yes, as I've said, A or B in those rooms would include public buildings, hotels, shopping malls, gymnasiums, sports, dance studios, theatres, concert pubs, assembly halls. Quite a list of building types get covered by that requirement. And then the other one would be food processing and occupied cold stores. So anyway, England has suggested this is the item that we have to correct, but England had suggested introducing a requirement that ventilation systems for these spaces should also be designed to provide a minimum of 15 litres per second per person of outdoor air, but that actual measure wasn't taken forward. I think that there's a more widespread review of research being undertaken on that, and so that wasn't taken forward. So we'll look to correct that question. I think it's question 4B.7, or sorry, 4C, that should be 7, and we'll look to see if we can correct that. England's guidance on ventilation and offices includes other measures that would be based around reducing the risk of infection. So these are ventilation requirements to include common areas such as corridors at a rate of 0.5 litres per second or openings of 1/50th of the floor area. And then similarly, there are requirements for outdoor air supply to office spaces amended to 1 litre per second per square metre of floor area or 10 litres per second per person, whichever is the higher. So I think the 1 litre per second per square metre of floor area was a new additional kind of check. It's a kind of backstop to people arguing, I suppose, that there's a very low level of occupancy in the office space. And then final point was that mechanical ventilation systems to be designed with a capability to filter, disinfect or avoid the recirculation of air, i.e. operate in an outdoor air only mode. So this is in recirculating systems. There would be a bypass switch at times of where there was an infection risk concern that could just knock that system out and it wouldn't recirculate, or if it did, it was passing through suitable disinfecting or filtering process that would remove the potential infection risk. Other measures considered under England's future building consultation. So this is, if you look at our third point here, this includes the 15 litres per second per person argument that we have to correct. But the other measures which weren't taken forward were the ability to continuously operate extract fans at intermittent operation rates in sanitary accommodation, so that the extract fans would effectively be able to run continuously at their more boosted kind of level. And another requirement for purge ventilation capacity to be increased to office spaces. These weren't taken forward as the scientific evidence supporting action in this area is still emerging. So again, we expect that any measures like this, which are considered by the UK government to be appropriate, will be accommodated in subsequent uplifts. We would look to try and replicate that as quickly as possible, or if that were to come through very suddenly, well, we'd try and bring that forward too. The department is not aware of any particular changes on commissioning on the non-domestic side, but we do, as I've said before there, we acknowledge that further reviews than that might be necessary, or might develop over time in future phases. We've got phases 4, phase 5 kind of coming, and we're looking or expecting to take on board any subsequent change that happens in other regions with that in mind. So that's largely where we are on ventilation. A final note, I suppose, to say that we have 3 more sessions to do here. The next week's session is on overheating, another one on following that on electric vehicle infrastructure provisions, and then a final one on more long-term kind of provisions. But that's where we are with that. So given that we've got some time here, we probably have 5 or 10 minutes, probably a little longer if needed. If there were